This article describes Haptify, a measurement-based haptic benchmarking system created by Farimah Fazlollahi and Katherine Kuchenbecker at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems. A grounded force feedback, or GFF haptic device, is a mechatronic system that is mounted to a stationary surface, like a table. It measures the user's motion and/or force and outputs forces and/or motions in response. Most such systems are impedance type, meaning that they are designed to be highly backdrivable with low moving mass and low friction to simulate free space. Activation of their internal motors makes them strong and stiff to give the feeling of hard contact. Grounded force feedback devices are a well-established and diverse class of haptic technology based on robotic arms. More than 100 GFF devices have been invented in the last 30 years. However, the number of designs and how they are specified make selecting a suitable device difficult. Although some researchers have sought to quantify the performance of individual haptic devices, meaningful comparisons are still unachievable because there are no standard, rigorous measurement practices. To solve these problems, we built Haptify, a benchmarking system that can thoroughly evaluate almost all GFF haptic devices without requiring device modifications. The user holds the device end effector and moves it to conduct different experiments. Haptify has three main sensing components that record the interaction between the human operator's hand and the device. The first component is a 7-camera optical motion capture system that records the positions and orientations of the device's links. The second is a 60-centimeter square custom force plate that accurately records the reaction forces applied to the device during use. The third is a sensing end effector that is customized to attach to each device's handle and records forces, torques, and vibrations between the user and the device. We show 6 methods of assessing the passive and active performance of GFF devices: workspace shape, global free space forces, global free space vibrations, local dynamic force and torque model, frictionless surface rendering, and stiffness rendering. We explain each of these output methods separately using Haptify to evaluate 2 commercial devices, a Touch and a Touch X. To find the exact shape and volume of each device's workspace, we tracked the device motion by placing retroreflective markers on the 2 sides of the end effector and averaging those measured positions. We went over all the joint limits, covering every corner, edge, and surface of the workspace. We then compared the measured and modeled workspaces for each device. To quantify what the user feels while moving in free space, the experimenter slowly moves the end effector within the device's workspace volume while recording the interaction force, position, velocity, acceleration, and handle orientation. The global free space forces for the Touch are much larger and more varied than they are for the Touch X. Parasitic vibrations also deteriorate the feel of a GFF device. The 3D acceleration signals from the global free space experiment were first high-pass filtered and then combined using the DFT 3-to-1 method. The resulting vibration signal for the Touch has a higher root mean square magnitude and a lower spectral centroid frequency than the Touch X. The interaction forces that the user would feel while interacting with different haptic devices are not easy to calculate from the specifications that are currently provided by device inventors and companies. To capture the local dynamic behavior of a device, we move the end effector quickly back and forth in the X, Y, Z, and diagonal directions, starting from the center of the workspace. The interaction forces and torques and the end effector motions are all recorded. These real haptic systems present nonlinear behavior, several vibration modes, and distributed masses. Therefore, we fit a nonlinear Hammerstein-Wiener local dynamic force and torque model through the recorded data using the MATLAB System Identification Toolbox. The inputs of the model are the end effector's position, orientation, velocity, and acceleration. The output are the forces and torques that the user feels. To examine and validate the fitted models, we defined a distance metric between the data on which the model was trained and other possible trajectories that a user could make. We created test sets containing 4 other experiments and calculated the force error between the model's estimated interaction force and the real force measurements. As you can see in these plots, lower values of our distance metric tend to have lower force errors. When the tested trajectory's distance metric increases, the model becomes more likely to predict interaction forces with higher errors. Furthermore, the model for the touch X achieves lower force errors than the model for the touch. To compare how well the two devices can actively render virtual haptic content, we created a virtual surface that is frictionless and stiff. The user first tested the rendering of frictionless contact by pressing gently into the surface and moving in a circle over and over. Although the commanded forces in the horizontal plane were always 0, both devices exerted non-trivial forces on the user. The touch outputs higher forces than the touch X, particularly in the Y direction. The experimenter then repeatedly pressed down into the stiff virtual surface without moving laterally with each device. As you can see on the right, the measured stiffness for both devices is quite a bit lower than the commanded stiffness of 0.75 newtons per millimeter. The touch X renders a stiffness that is much closer to the commanded stiffness than the touch, and it also reaches a higher peak normal force. In this article, we presented the benchmarking system Haptify, which can thoroughly evaluate almost all GFF haptic devices. Our benchmarking methods are workspace shape, global free space forces, global free space vibrations, local dynamic force and torque model, frictionless surface rendering, and stiffness rendering. Although it has a slightly larger workspace than the Touch X, the Touch is shown to output larger free space forces and larger free space vibrations, have dynamic forces that are more difficult to model, and exert higher planar forces and lower stiffness and lower peak force when rendering a frictionless stiff surface. By quantifying how GFF devices feel to use, Haptify aims to expedite the advancement of haptic technology in the same way that benchmarking has helped other fields, both within and outside of robotics.